As we continue our series this morning, unfortunately I have to start with bad news. I don't know if you were aware of this, but we're in the middle of an election season. And when we're in the middle of an election season, sometimes things can get pretty divisive. Now, I know what you're saying, like we just did primaries a couple weeks ago. How much of a vacation do we get? And unfortunately, with conventions coming up, we're just moving right into general elections. And if we got any respite and the ads and whatnot, we know those will be picking up very soon. And so that's the first bit of bad news. The other bit of bad news, as I said, is that we're bitterly divided in the midst of that reality. We find this to be a difficult conversation to talk about, a difficult season to talk with people who have different views from us. And if you have any questions about our dividedness, just feel free to tune into your favorite or your least favorite 24-hour news station, and you can hear all about it. That's where we find ourselves in the midst of this. And all of this election and politics and everything that's coming can cause us to want to look away in the midst of this season. It can drive us to distance ourselves, to put space between our neighbors, loved ones who are on the other side of an issue, from coworkers. It can cause us to sort of separate or avoid any conversation, because it feels like every kind of conversation around it is almost inherently, or at least teetering on the edge of being icky. We don't like it. We don't want anything to do with it. But you know me, I'm a pastor, and I always want to ask this question in the midst of whatever season we find ourselves or whatever difficulty we are wrestling with. What does our faith have to say about this? And so I want to begin to address that a little bit. And we started even last week. Last week we began this series looking at an unusual set of instructions or directions that God gives to the exiles, the Israelite exiles, in the midst of their difficult season. And God gives these directions through Jeremiah. And so let's unpack all of that. Jeremiah, we said, is a prophet, an Old Testament prophet who has a lot to say, and he began his ministry of prophecy in about 625 BC. And he begins saying that things are going to happen and things are going to change. And sure enough, that happens. And where we're reading from today comes about 25 years later. Jeremiah is writing to people who have been sent in exile. And so that's where we find ourselves today. Now, what is exile? Where are they? What is going on? Well, for most of the years of Jeremiah's ministry, the Babylonian Empire has been the preeminent empire of the day, and they've been just a few kingdoms away from Israel, a few kingdoms away from Jerusalem. And then when that stronghold sort of breaks, it's like the floodgates open and the Babylonians move in, and basically they come in and they say, we're in charge now. And so they destroy much of the city. There's fighting and some people die, and then they say, we're gonna take money from you, we're gonna charge taxes, and they become an occupying force. And that's how things lie for a while, until this moment, the 597 moment. There is this attempted uprising. You see, people have had arguments about what they should do with this empire that's now occupying them, how they should respond. And some people, Jeremiah has said, we need to sit in this and just wait and accept what it is. Others have said we should sort of run and go away. We don't want any part of this. And others have said, no, we should try and overthrow. We should try to take the power back. And that's what ends up happening. And to put it shortly, it doesn't go well. They get basically massacred in the process. And so the empire, the Babylonians, then say, no more Mr. Nice Guy. You can't just stay in this space anymore. Now we're going to take a group of people, your wealthiest people and your leaders and all of their families, and they're going into exile. So they walk hundreds of miles to the Babylonian capital where they are forced to live. And so they've seen things go from bad to worse, and that's the reality that they find themselves in. And for what we're reading in this series, we're reading some of the words that God gives to Jeremiah, who is still in Jerusalem, to send in letters to the exiles. And that's the context that we pick ourselves up in. That's where we find things today. God is sending these words through Jeremiah to the people. And last week we said that's an important piece. We need not to miss that, because sometimes we think when everything has gone as bad as it possibly could, when everything has gone from bad to worse, when things feel as icky and as gross and as painful as they could possibly be, sometimes we feel like God just leaves us on our own in the midst of that. But Jeremiah is a testament that that isn't true. In the midst of the most difficult season that they've seen, in the midst of having faced difficulty and violence and now separation from the place that they call home, God continues to speak, and that's an important piece of Jeremiah's message. That's an important piece for us to remember. God continues to speak even in the midst of difficult seasons. But the words that God speaks aren't what they expected. They aren't what maybe the people were anticipating or hoping to hear, because remember we said some wanted to overthrow and to fight and to battle, and some wanted to run away, and there was a kind of a small group saying just sit and accept it. And so what God says, we read last week in Jeremiah 29, God says to build houses and to plant gardens and to marry and to have children and to give your children in marriage and have children and grandchildren. That's not the word that they wanted to hear, right? They wanted to hear not build and plant, but destroy and overthrow. Not settle down and be there for a while, but figure out how to get us out of this place. But God says to them in Jeremiah 29, no, settle into this place. And remember with me, if you will, that those words, that planting and that building, but then the marrying and having children connects us all the way back to the Exodus narrative, the very creation story. Because when God creates humankind, the first thing it says after God creates humankind, Genesis chapter 1, the first thing is it says that God blesses them and tells them to be fruitful and to multiply, to continue in this celebration all the way back to Genesis. Jeremiah is calling us to remind the people and to tell the people to expect and to anticipate and that they can experience blessing even in the midst of this difficult season, that these truths, that this blessing, that this opportunity that God has called them to from the beginning of creation continues even in this difficult season. So the words are unexpected. And it goes further in today's reading, because no matter what people thought, no matter what the exiles, what the people back in Israel thought, no matter what they thought about how we should handle the Babylonian problem, the people whom are oppressing them, they all despised the Babylonians. They had wreaked havoc and caused violence, and they had separated families and injured people. And so everybody had this sort of universal disgust. They disliked and detested even the culture of the Babylonians, everything about them. They disliked the people, they disliked their power, they disliked the way they treated the Israelites. There was this overall feeling of disgust at the conversation, this feeling of distrust with anything that they would do, that there was always some deeper motive. They had this feeling that no matter what was going to come out of the Babylonians, it was going to be bad and awful and icky. There's that word again. And I think many of us who have been in the midst of living and have experienced politics, we have that same sort of feeling, a distrust, and no matter what happens, somebody's going to be hurt and it's not going to be good, and we want nothing to do with it. And we withdraw. But remember, God continues to speak, and so God has a word for the people of Israel. And this direction comes immediately after what we read last week around those directions to build and to plant. In this letter, God says to them in chapter in verse 7. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your own welfare. Now, friends, be aware that God has just taken things to a whole new level. No longer is it just about seek the good for yourself, but rather continue to pray and to seek the good for those that are around you. In this new community that you find yourself in this place that you didn't want to go in the first place, now you are to seek the welfare or the well-being of those people around you. That word, that welfare, that can be translated as peace. Seek the peace or seek the well-being of the people that are there. And this is scandalous because last week the idea build and plant, marry and celebrate, find life and celebration in the midst of where you are, we can sort of understand that. God wants to bless us in the midst of difficult seasons, and we like that and we appreciate that, and that's fine. But now today it's a whole new thing, that thriving, that celebrating, that surviving that we're talking about in the midst of the hard time. Pray also for that, for the city where you are, for the people who brought you here, for the people who have taken so much from you. Seek that welfare, that blessing, that peace, that shalom, that goodness for the place that you are right now. And this would have been quite an affront to the exiles. This would have been quite a challenge. Because not only now is it about us receiving God's blessing, but we're supposed to pray and to seek and to hope that the people who have hurt us will have the same thing. Rather than withdrawing or overflowing, God is saying to engage in what's going on and not just seek the goodness of your little commune of those who are with you and on your side, but rather to seek the well-being of those who would seek or who already have sought to do you harm. And friends, that is a word and that is a challenge in the midst of this season. In the midst of this election season, in the midst of this bitterly divided season, how do we seek the welfare, the peace, the common good? How do we wrap our minds around that idea? How do we engage with a system or with people or with a party or with beliefs or with policies that we find frustrating or harmful or difficult or just all around icky? How do we engage with all of that or across all of that in order to strengthen communities, to seek the welfare of our city or our state or our nation? That's the question. So I have some friends down in Wichita. A fellow pastor friend helps run an organization called the Neighboring Movement. It's a United Methodist affiliated organization, and they have spent their time in South Central Wichita, which is an underserved neighborhood, and they do a lot of community development in that space. They do a lot of resource development, and they've spent their lives sort of trying to cultivate goodness in the midst of a neighborhood, of a community that's most often been overlooked or thought of as a place to avoid or stay away from. And one of the things that they've done, and it's really challenged me, is they've created in the midst of this upcoming election season, this sermon series, and they call it Tending the Civic Soil. And it's an invitation to take on some of these challenges. So over the next few weeks, I'll be pulling some of the ideas that they've shared. They developed this in consultation with a group called the Voter Network. It's a Kansas-based, nonpartisan voter registration and turnout group, as well as the United Methodist Health Ministry Fund. They've put all of this together. And in the midst of engaging all of this, I've been challenged. I want to invite you into some of that challenge of what it means to tend to the soil that provides opportunity for things to grow and to thrive. So all of this for them is based on the parable of the sower. If you have a Bible, I would invite you to pull it out, or if you want to pull it up in your Bible, it's Matthew 13, and I want to read some of these words. I think this is a good challenge for us to read this a little bit differently. We'll begin in verse 3. And Jesus was talking to them in parables, and he said this, "Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path where the birds came and they ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil, so they sprang up quickly, and since they had no depth of soil, but when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them out. Still other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. Let anyone with ears listen. Now, every time I read in the parables, I'm challenged because I oftentimes want to think that Jesus is talking about those people, the not me's. That when Jesus is talking about this, he means somebody who isn't myself. And we do that often, right? We want to say like, oh, we're the good soil. Everybody else must be something else. But I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about. I think what we should do is try to see ourselves in the midst of this. What if instead of thinking of it about being somebody else, about somebody else's ability to bear fruit, what if instead we see ourselves as those who are contributing to a communal soil? What does it look like to create spaces where, when God spreads seeds, when there's goodness of blessing that God provides, that it's able to bear fruit, that it's able to thrive, that it's able to produce 30 or 60 or 100-fold? What if we see ourselves as those who are called to tend the garden? Remember, that goes all the way back to the Genesis narrative, to tend to what God has given us, to create soil in which what God blesses us with can bear fruit and can thrive. In Jeremiah's language, what if we see ourselves as those who are called to be seeking the welfare, even in the places where it feels icky, to be seeking the welfare and cultivating the well-being of ourselves and others? That's where I see us in this. And friends, that's the reason that I want us to talk about this for the rest of the month. Listen, I know that it makes us uncomfortable, this idea of talking about politics, and it's taboo to bring up politics in church and to mix those together, and I'm aware of that. I know that. I get that it's hard to talk about elections, but I don't think it should be. Because it's on our minds, it's on your minds, it's on my mind, it's on every TV all of the time, and in the newspapers and in the updates and in the social media. It's happening all around us. So what good do we do ourselves if we withdraw and pretend like it's not happening? What good do we do if we refuse to acknowledge it or decide it's just too icky? I think it's on all of our hearts and minds, and so we ought to be engaged in it. We do ourselves a disservice if we don't. So I want to talk about it over these next few weeks, but I'll make you some promises right here at the front. Number one, I'm not here for partisanship or to wrangle you into one way of voting or another. Honestly, that's far too simple and far too narrow an outcome. I do hope that you'll participate, that you'll vote, but that isn't even the ultimate goal. People feeling like their voices matter, feeling like they're invested in that to me, that's an outcome of tending the soil well, of investing in the welfare. When people feel like their opinion, their voice matters, it means we've cultivated a good civic space. That's part of the fruit that bears out. So that's one thing, but I also want us to think about soil that grows all sorts of well-being, soil that allows people to feel valued and supported, even if they are among the most vulnerable or the least resourced. I want us to think about ways that we can invest in communal spaces that foster civic strength. I want us to think about how we partner with local organizations and businesses that are investing in our communities. And in this season of politicking, even if we don't like it, even if it makes us uncomfortable, I think that what it does is it calls us and invites us to seek the welfare of the place that we are, to seek after the common good. So that's what we'll talk about. Now, I'm practical. I want you to do those things, to think about what it means to engage in those spaces. But I wanted to leave you with something really, really practical, really actionable over these next few weeks. I wanted to give you a challenge. So in the next few months, it is my hunch that you will see somebody post an opinion on some sort of social media that you disagree with. In the next couple of hours, next couple of months. That's going to happen. It is my hunch that you will hear a politician say something that feels abhorrent to you, that triggers perhaps a feeling of anger. My hunch is that in the next couple of months, somebody that you love will say something and you will think to yourself, why do I love them? Okay? My guess is that those things are going to happen over the next few weeks, that maybe there is a coworker who's going to say something that you think is so far off the wall or off base that you're not sure what to do with it. In this environment that we have, our immediate response is to go on the aggressive. We want to out-attack our opponent. We, like the exiles, we want to overthrow and destroy, and we get this like destroy mindset. We will kill. Or maybe you're different. Maybe when that happens, when that happens around the water cooler at work or on the Zoom meeting, suddenly you disappear and you just need to go blank for a second to check your face, or you want to disengage or walk away. You want to avoid. But regardless of which of those responses or somewhere in the middle you are, I want to challenge you to do something different. As you process through your response, and I want to invite us to process through instead of react, as we process through our response to that person, to that thing that we've heard, that other idea that we disagree with, I want us to consider framing our response in this way. If somebody says, I believe that we should do that, I want you to think, I think that the way that we move towards the common good is this. And I want you to frame it in that way. I know it's different. I know it's a lot of words, and it doesn't immediately move to mudslinging, which is sometimes our favorite thing to do. But I want you to say, I believe that the way we move towards the common good is this. Or perhaps you want to say it a little bit differently. Maybe you want to say, I think that the way that we cultivate the healthiest civic soil is this. Or maybe you want to say it like this, I think that this is what it looks like to seek the peace or to seek the welfare of our city, state, nation. Because, friends, here's what I'm going to tell you. Even though we sometimes convince ourselves that those other people who disagree with us, who think wrongly, that they are only in it for themselves or that they're just not seeing it, I think most people want to seek after the common good. We have very different ideas about what that looks like. And so maybe somebody will say, that's a really weird way to respond. And you can say, well, my pastor told me I had to say it that way. And you can reference this. Or maybe they'll say, well, what do you think the common good is? And that becomes a conversation point, and you realize there are different ways. And friends, I hope that in these conversations, by reframing the question, whether it's a conversation or your own internal response, whether you choose to do this within yourself, that what it will do is it will reframe something that we often withdraw from or find icky or want to avoid, that it will change that. And that instead we might listen and we might learn to live out of a place of love. And it doesn't mean that suddenly we're all going to get along and we're all going to agree and have the same policies and positions and politicians and beliefs. That's not what I'm saying. I don't live in that kind of utopia. What I think it does is it creates the possibility of less aggressive dialogue. And so that, friends, is this week's first challenge. That when you encounter some sort of policy, position, politician, belief that you disagree with, be it in your head or in your conversation, I want you to reframe it about why you think a different thing brings us towards the common good, brings us towards healthy civic soil, the ground that we all share in. And perhaps what we might find is that when we do that, when we create commonality or when we reframe what it is that we're looking for, just like God has told the exiles to do when they seek the welfare of that place, even with those whom they disagree, they will find their own welfare as well. May it be the same for you and I. Let's take a few moments for reflection. As we come into a time of offering, I want to invite you to continue to support the ministry that's happening on this Sunday as we're celebrating the opportunity to have Grace as an intern here. That's made possible by folks investing in the work that's happening. And so thank you for that. As we continue in worship, I want to invite you to stand as we sing our closing song.